Hey everyone, JP here with something a little different that might be of interest to my fellow sound engineer nerds. For years, even decades now, I haven't been able to find a concise resource for all of the models and variations of the classic era Neve mic preamp and EQ modules. By classic era, I mean from the company's early 60s origins through the mid to late 70s, just after Rupert Neve left the company in 1975. There's a lot of info on the more popular models like the 1073 and 1081, but hardly anything on the earlier Germanium preamps and the console-to-console variations of them all. I've tried to gather as much here as possible from great resources like former Neve employee Jeff Tanner's many informative GearSpace posts and rec.audio.pro before that, stretching back to the 90s. Now, also the wonderful Post-Fade website, linked below, which has a ton of great in-depth Neve console history, and I suggest checking out after you watch this. My goal is to cover as much of the practical information that a recording engineer might find relevant without getting too in the weeds on the technical stuff. Also, I'm sure there are some models or variations that we unknowingly left out, and welcome your comments for any additional information. While Rupert Neve began building tube or valve-based mixers as early as 1959, it wasn't until 1964 that he began experimenting with transistors, particularly germanium transistors, for microphone and line amp design. As their smaller size and lower power demands compared to tubes allowed for a smaller footprint, the idea of a modular design with several EQ bands included became popular, and the first Neve transistor console was built for Philips Records, a 16-channel mobile unit featuring the 1051 mic input module. Finished in shiny black with bakelite knobs, the style would follow for the next 4 years, with the brick-built modular design allowing for much easier repair and maintenance than a one-piece unit. There's not much info available on the original 1051 or 1052 circuits, but the fully modular 1053 is generally regarded as the start of this classic line. These and all subsequent models through the 1062 used his B100 mic preamp board, featuring a pair of PNP germanium transistors, usually a Mullard AC107 or equivalent New Market NKT216 for about 80 dB of gain. The preceding line amp and output cards used a combination of germanium and silicon transistors like the Mullard BC109 and OC36. The entirety of the circuit was Class A discrete design throughout. It's important to note that the terms Class A and Class AB are not a rating system, but a descriptor of amplifier operation. One is not better than the other, although they sound unique. Class AB is actually more efficient as an output stage, but we'll get to that later when Neve began employing it. As a balanced input and output was required, transformers were crucial to the sound of these modules, with Gardner's 7524 or 7529 models used for the microphone inputs of all germanium models, and Rupert's own design, the gapped LO1166, used on the output. He wound the first pieces by hand in his home shop, but as demand began growing, commissioned nearby Mariner Radar to supply them based on his specs. This would remain a constant output transformer in all Class A Neve modules for over a decade. After Mariner closed down, St. Ives, and then bought by Carnhill, took over manufacture. Another important note on these early designs was that the input and output transformers could not always fit inside the modules, with some mounted to the console frame nearest the XLR connectors. As each console was a unique custom order at this point, the modules were designed based on the customer's requirements, with size a concern in smaller mobile broadcast trucks. Decades later, when the concept of vintage audio came about in the recording world, many of these modules were found without the original input or output transformers intact, and the market of rack mounting them with additional transformers, or even transformerless operation, became big business. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. At 2.8-inch width, the 1053 contains its Mariner output transformer inside of the module chassis, with the Gardner input transformer mounted on a rear panel socket. The 1053 also featured an EQ circuit containing a high-frequency booster cut at 10K, variable booster cut of mid-frequency at 700, 1.2K, 2.4K, 3.8K, or 7 kHz, booster cut of lows at 35, 60, 100, or 220 Hz, and an additional high-pass filter of 20, 45, 70, 170, or 360 Hz. This 3-band plus filter design would be prominent in many Neves to come with slight variations per module. The 1053 module first appeared in a custom 20-channel desk for Philips Studio in London in 1966. Dusty Springfield's You Don't Have to Say You Love Me was one of the first things recorded with it in early '66, as well as the album version of The Look of Love in 1967. The console even made the cover of the Living Presence LP, a showcase of 4-track stereo recording in 1968. The 1053 module was also used in the Wessex Church Hall Neve console, where the classic King Crimson debut album In the Court of the Crimson King was recorded in 1969. Next was the 1054, also in 1966, designed for an Intertel 24-channel mobile truck desk at a narrower module at 1.8-inch width. The EQ was much more limited, with selectable presence similar to the 1053's mid-range values and a fixed 100 Hz low-frequency booster cut. Both transformers were mounted externally. Intertel liked this desk so much they ordered another larger console that we'll get into in a little bit. Also in 1966, the 1055 module was designed for the new PSM portable sound mixer. A 2.8-inch wide panel with 3 bands of fixed frequency booster cut, input transformer internal but output transformer mounted externally. The very first studio I ever interned and assisted at, Showplace Studios in Dover, New Jersey, had a pair of these. As the owner and head engineer, Ben Elliott, was a vintage gear junkie, this would be my indoctrination into a lifelong cult. In 1967, the 1056 module was designed for the new Radio Luxembourg 8-channel mono desk, with 2-band EQ of 1.5K, 3K, or 6 kHz on top, and 200, 400, or 800 Hz on the bottom. This module and desk was notable for the original version of the Arnold Corns Band's Moon Age Daydream single, featuring a very young David Bowie. He also recorded the early Ziggy Stardust demos at the studio. Also in 67, the 1057 module was designed for a new console at Chapel Studios, with a 1.8-inch width but a longer length than previous models. This style was a look towards the future of their designs, with a 3-band EQ section of fixed 10K high shelf, 700, 1.2K, 2.4K, 3.8K, or 7 kHz presence, or mid-range, and 35, 60, 100, or 220 cycle lows, plus a high-pass filter of 20, 45, 70, 180, or 360 cycles. The 1057s would make another appearance in the first Neve commissioned for the United States at Chicago Sound Studios in 1968, with one big difference. Instead of shiny black with bakelite knobs, a revised new Royal Air Force shade of gray-blue was used for the panels, with gray Marconi knobs. This aesthetic choice was first chosen by Pi Studios for their Neve earlier in the same year, which used 2057 EQ-only line input modules, along 1059 mic and high-pass filter modules in a separate rack. Those Chicago 1057s are most notable not only for being the first in the US Neve console, but also for 16 of them being purchased and racked up by producer Michael Beinhorn in the early 90s and used primarily for drum tracking on his productions, beginning with a personal favorite, Soundgarden's Super Unknown in 1994. Beinhorn has talked extensively about how much he loves the sound of drums through these Germanium modules, and, quote, never heard such depth, dimension, or impact as if the drums were jumping out of the speaker, end quote. They accompanied him over the next few decades of hit-making until being listed for sale at $170,000 recently to the time of this video. And remember that Intertel mobile desk they liked so much in 66? The next one was ordered in 68 with new 1058 modules, although these were designed before the color change of the Pi Chicago desks. Confusing enough? The 1058 EQ had a fixed high frequency of 10K, presence or mids selectable at 1.75K, 2.5K, 3.5K, 5K, or 7 kHz, and a fixed 100 Hz low-frequency booster cut. The input transformer was externally mounted, and this is notable because our friend Michael Beinhorn also has a rack of these that he loves on guitars, and has stated that his actually have a transformerless input wired, which yields a different sound than the Gardner input transformer 1057s so beloved on drums. While piecing this together, I learned that the Intertel 1058 desk ended up in Australia, where it was used in a TV studio and eventually discarded. An employee literally pulled it out of the dumpster and sold the modules to Fletcher of Mercenary Audio in Massachusetts, one of the first and most prominent dealers of vintage recording gear when that market began to take off in the early 90s. And here's the fun part. That first studio I worked at, Showplace, had a pair of 1058s that came from the owner Ben's good friend and engineering legend, Jason Corsaro, who worked on Soundgarden's Super Unknown with Michael Beinhorn. Jason still kept 2 modules of his own in a Mercenary rack, just like Beinhorn's, and it's entirely possible that the 1058s owned by Ben Elliott, Jason Corsaro, and Michael Beinhorn were all from that same Intertel Neve desk in Australia. Since Ben and Jason have both sadly passed on, maybe Michael can fill us in if he sees this? Getting back to our rundown, as briefly mentioned earlier, the 1059 model was a mic pre and high pass filter with values of 20, 45, and 75 Hz, which sat in a separate rack from the 2057 EQ channels in the Pi Studios console. Neve used the 20 prefix to designate correction modules with EQ and/or filter circuits, and just a 40 dB line amp with an input transformer and the usual LO1166 output transformer. I've seen these passed off as low-gain mic preamps for sale, but in truth, they were designed for use following a true 80 dB mic gain circuit. The next model, the 1060, is notable for being used in the Anvil Studios Star Wars Neve console, used for the scoring of, you guessed it, the first Star Wars film. Interestingly, the mic gain knob was on the bottom of this module, and it was the first to feature an EQ in-out knob switch. The EQ was 3 bands with no filter, fixed 10K high frequency, mids the same as the 1058, and a fixed 100 Hz low frequency. If you look again at the picture of Michael Beinhorn's 1058 rack, you'll see a single 1060 on the right of it. 2 more Germanium models left to cover. The 1061, notable for being used in New York City's first Neve console at Vanguard Records in 1969, featured a 3-band EQ with no filter, high frequency fixed at 10K, mids of 700, 3.25K, 5K, and 7 kHz, and low frequency of 60, 100, or 220 Hz. And finally, the 1062, the last Germanium Neve model, used in a Philips 8-channel mixer. Apologies, but I could not find an individual picture of this model. The EQ had a fixed 10K high frequency, low frequency of 35, 60, 110, and 220 Hz. High pass filter, 20, 45, 70, 160, or 360 Hz, and the first sighting of a low pass filter with frequencies of 6K, 8K, 10K, 14K, and 18 kHz, but oddly no mid-range or presence. Again, the common aspects of all these great Germanium Neve modules are the B100 mic preamp circuit with its 2 Germanium transistors, Gardner input transformers, and Marinair LO1166 output transformers, except in the case of Beinhorn's transformerless input 1058s, of course. By late 1969, Neve had a new facility in Melbourne, UK, a new mic preamp circuit utilizing more consistent silicon transistors, and a new way to fit more controls into the narrow 1.8-inch by 8.75-inch panel that would be the new norm, save for a few 12-inch long models. They were entering a new decade and about to set a new standard for recording, with mic gain now on a new eye-catching red knob. The 1063 would be the first of the new models, with Millard BC109 and 107 TO18 style silicon transistors, a new Marinair input transformer internally mounted along with the classic LO1166 output transformer, and the first circuit with a negative ground power supply, all of which would remain as standard throughout this new series. There was only a mic input, no separate line in, and also included 2 push-button switches for EQ in-out and phase reversal. It was also the first to utilize dual concentric knobs for adjusting EQ frequency and boost cut, allowing for more options in less space. Used first in the new Tim Studio console, the EQ had a fixed 10K high frequency shelf, mids of 700, 1.2K, 2.4K, 3.8K, and 7 kHz, low frequency of 35, 60, 100, or 220 Hz, and a high pass filter of 45, 70, 160, or 360 Hz. Next, we have the 1064, a 12-inch long version of the 1063 with a separate line input and the same EQ frequencies as the 1063, but individual controls in lieu of the dual concentric knobs, presumably for those that fear change. This module was first used in the British Pathé News console, and another shout out to Showplace, Ben had a racked pair. There were several variations on this model, including the 1064A, which featured stepped rotary controls instead of continuously variable pots, the 1064C, which bypassed the mic preamp entirely, and the 1064E, which had additional presence frequencies and was used on console A243 for EMI Elstree. If anyone has specific info on the B or D variants, I'd love to know about them. There also seems to be conflicting info on whether the standard or A version has these stepped controls, with Neve schematics contradicting gut shots. I can't recall exactly which variant Showplace had over 20 years later. Following that, we have the 1065, used in a Pi 12-channel desk, same 8.75-inch size like the 1063 with dual concentric EQ controls, but no high-pass filter. The 1066 soon followed with individual transformer inputs from mic and line, high-pass filter of 35, 70, 160, or 360 Hz, and the same mids, highs, and low shelf as the 1063 and 64. This was used in the first BCM-10 broadcast mixer sidecar desks. A stepped control version of the 1066 would come later as the 1074 model, as well as the 1075, which had an impedance switch in lieu of phase, and the 1080 mastering model with stepped controls and both high-pass and low-pass filters like that old 1062 model we mentioned. A few more models of note. The 1067, a 3-band limited version of the 1066, had fixed high and low shelves and no filters. The 1068 was mentioned in technical drawings for the BCM mixers, but doesn't seem to exist in reality, at least not that I'm aware of. The 1069 was a mono turntable preamp, and the 1072 was a stereo version of that. In 1970, we have the introduction of the 1070 module as a 1063 replacement, mostly known in its 12-inch 1070L configuration. The L stands for long, not line, as it did not have a separate line input. The longer variant had individual controls, while the shorter standard version had dual concentric EQ and the same frequencies as the 1063. They were used in the ATV Network's A177 and A258 wraparound consoles, which also included smaller 6-channel submixers using the B002 modules with only one gain stage for 50 dB of mic gain. These consoles featured 12 of these submixers each for 72 total mic inputs, in addition to the 28 1070L modules for 100 inputs total. Steve Albini owned one of these 6-input submixers, and another one has recently been listed for sale at a price of $16,000 at the time of this recording. Later in 1970, we get the most well-known, widely used, and most valuable of the vintage Neve modules, the vaunted 1073. Originally used in the Wessex A88 28-channel console, the first Neve designed for use with a 24-track tape machine, the 1073 circuit was very similar to the 1066 with its separate mic and line transformer inputs, differences being new BC182 and 184 transistors in the mic preamp, and more indifferent EQ frequency options with a new 12K high shelf, 360, 700, 1.6K, 3.2K, 4.8K, and 7.2 kHz in the mids, same lows as the 1063, and high-pass filter of 50, 80, 160, and 300 Hz. The 1073 eventually replaced the 1066 in the broadcast mixer BCM-10 desks as well. There were several variants of the 1073, including the 1076 stepped control version, the 1077 with only 50 dB mic gain and stepped control made for Decca, and the 1078 with an added 10K option in the mid-EQ band. The 1079 was a single input version of the 1073 with the mid frequencies of the 1066, but retains the low options of the 73. A later variant called the 1088 was designed with a unique ribbon mic input to prevent damage from console-generated 48-volt phantom power connections, which could happen to some mics. The 1089 was actually the same as the 1073 module, but with the line gain going backwards from the mic gain as a broadcast request. In 1972, we see the introduction of another well-known classic, the 1081, in a 12-inch long chassis. This was unique as it featured an additional EQ band with extensive frequencies throughout, making it 4-band plus 2 filters, and also a new Class AB output stage, a first for Neve channel modules. For anyone familiar with guitar amplifiers, think of it like this. From the mic and line inputs throughout the EQ, the preamp is entirely Class A until it reaches a push-pull output stage, offering improved efficiency over the previously used Class A single-ended stages, delivering more output from less power, and a much improved signal-to-noise ratio due to cancellation of any common mode noise interference. And like a guitar amp, this requires a different type of output transformer design, with Neve using the new LO2567 by Marinair. This, along with the extended EQ, made the 1081 and its subsequent variations a favorite of mix engineers for years to come. And yet again, Showplace had a racked pair that I got to play with as a very lucky 20-year-old. The 1081 was first used in the A599 Paris console, whose design would eventually become the 8048 when the 80 series of desks was established a short time later. The 1081 could also be ordered along with the 12-inch 1064 for 8036 or 38 consoles. The comprehensive EQ frequencies included a variable high shelf of 3.3K, 4.7K, 6.8K, 10K, and 15 kHz, plus a new push-button bell option for that band, another first for Neve. High-mids covered 1.5K, 1.8K, 2.2K, 2.7K, 3.3K, 3.9K, 4.7K, 5.6K, 6.8K, and 8.2 kHz, with a new high Q option to tighten the booster cut bandwidth. The low midband also featured high Q with frequencies of 220, 270, 330, 390, 470, 560, 680, 820, 1K, or 1.2 kHz. Low shelf also with the bell option at 33, 56, 100, 180, or 330 Hz. Low pass filter of 3.9K, 5.6K, 8.2K, 12K, and 18 kHz, and high pass filter of 27, 47, 82, 150, and 270 Hz. The 1083 was a stepped control version of the 1081. And the obscure 1090 is a line input only 1081 with stepped controls and no filters. While this new exhaustively comprehensive design was welcomed by some, many still preferred the simpler 1073 module style, and the 1082 was a Class A compromise with expanded frequencies from the 1073, such as 10K, 12K, or 16 kHz high shelf, mids of 360, 700, 1.6K, 3.2K, 4.8K, and 7.2 kHz with the high Q switch, lows of 35, 60, 110, and 220, high pass filter of 45, 70, 160, and 360 Hz, and low pass of 8K, 10K, 14K, and 18K. The 1084 module was also the same Class A circuit as the 1073 and 1082 with some slightly different frequency options, and was most notably used in the Sound City 8028 console, adding to the sonics of many classic albums from Fleetwood Mac and Tom Petty to Nirvana and Tool, now owned by Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters at his Studio 606 and featured prominently in the 2013 Sound City documentary. Many have falsely stated that this console features 1073 modules, but while the circuit is 99% the same, the added high Q switch on the midband is the dead giveaway. The 8028, along with the 8014, 8016, and 8036 consoles could be ordered with 1066, 1073, 1082, or 1084 modules. Personally, I think the 1082 and 1084 were the pinnacle of the all-Class A Neve modules, with the same great mic preamp, transformers, and output section as the 1073, but just enough additional EQ frequencies to make it more versatile without being overkill. The 1085 was a stepped version of the 1084, and the 1086 was an 84 with fixed high shelf. As the role of the mix engineer became more prevalent, the extensive 1081 circuit was becoming more popular, and one variant that I was lucky to spend a lot of time with was the 1093, initially designed for 8 consoles ordered from EMI in 1975. It uses the same motherboard as the 1081, with the only difference being special transformers chosen for extremely low noise and marked by a sticker. A mic pre-only module called the 1091 was also designed for these EMI desks, but mounted separately from the console. The studio I worked at after Showplace, Bear Tracks in upstate New York, had a rack of 4 1093s owned by our head engineer, which could be rented for sessions. They offered a significant character and punch compared to our Focusrite Studio console's ISA 110 channels, which also happened to be designed by Rupert Neve over a decade later. Also sharing the 1081 motherboard was the 1095 module used in the Utopia Studio consoles for the South African broadcast channel. These consoles were the basis for what became the 8078 console, often regarded as the pinnacle of the classic Neve consoles. While Rupert Neve left the company in 1975, it's still worth noting several modules that maintained his design legacy even after a facelift to a lighter shade of gray with more modern blue and silver knobs, and a new streamlined production process to keep up with the increased demand of a booming industry. The 31099 module was essentially a 1073 without a line input, and the 31102 was a 1084 module without the line input for all intents and purposes. Either of these modules could be ordered with the 8058, 8066, 8068, or 8088 consoles. The 31105 was essentially a 1081 Class AB circuit and was used in the 8078 consoles. One 8078 that I have personal experience with is at the wonderful Pi Studios of Long Island, where owner Perry Margoliff keeps it impeccably maintained along with the rest of his impressive vintage gear collection. It's the only fully discrete 8078 on the East Coast, in fact. There was a period of time in the early 2000s when the value of these later blue-gray modules wasn't nearly as high as the older classic models, but just like that 62 Strat I passed up back then, they're out of reach for most of us now. And just for fun, there's also the 33106 modules, customized 4-band 1081 style like the 33105, built specifically for George Martin to his specifications for the 3 Air Studios Neve consoles. Rupert Neve was actually brought back in as a consultant at George Martin's request for this design. These studios also had new 34427 mic preamps designed to reside in the tracking room and were controlled remotely from the console for the lowest noise possible. As these are rarer than hen's teeth, it's unlikely you'll ever see them roaming free in the wild. A few worthy mentions. The 33115 modules from the 5302 Melbourne broadcast desks are a similar Class AB design as the 1081 with a reduced 3-band EQ, while the 33114 had a few more frequency options and an added low-pass filter. They were both offered in either classic discrete or new integrated circuit build styles, with the discrete costing a bit more. The 3104 module also appeared in some BBC broadcast desks and was similar to a 3-band 1081 circuit with a Class AB output and a smaller transformer. Additionally, the similar 33122, 129, and 135 broadcast modules were designed without output transformers and had a minus 10 dB output on their own, which worked better for the BBC's needs, but adds an extra step for anyone looking to rack mount them. This was similar to the 3116 and 3126 modules found in the Kelso broadcast mixers, darling little things. Although they look like the older classic style models, they only have fixed 10K and 100 Hz 2-band EQs with high-pass filters and no output transformer, as they fed minus 10 dB insert patch points from their output. With proper steps taken for the output, these can also be great sounding mic pre's, similar to the 1081 in that regard. These are physically similar to the early 70s PSM portable sound mixer modules, which are entirely Class A with more elaborate EQs, but also lack output transformers and use an obsolete multi-pin connector that makes them poor candidates for rack mounting. One quick note regarding the infamous 1272 circuit that started popping up everywhere in the late 90s. This was never used by Neve as a mic preamp. It was a line amp with about 40 dB of gain, like those 20 series correction units we mentioned earlier, and was used as a bus amplifier and talkback mic in some consoles. When the more valuable mic input channel modules were taken out of older decommissioned Neve frames, someone had the grand idea of repurposing these leftover circuits, and back circa 2000, it seemed a dozen brands were marketing their own versions of them. I owned a pair back then, I won't say whose. They were all right, but the lack of gain could be an issue with certain sources like Shure SM7 or certain ribbon mics needed more gain. The 1290 circuit is actually a much better raw option and the same preamp as a 1073 or similar Class A module with the output amp transformer. This era had plenty of 20 series line input modules too, either EQ correction units or other filters like this 2071 unit with fixed 50 dB gain and high and low pass filters. But beware of these being passed off as true mic preamps, like the listing I found for this pair with the addition of the classic red mic gain knob. There was also a 2067 telephone distortion simulator that I'd love to have someday just for the novelty of it. For the mastering engineers, there was the very rare 2087 stereo EQ, essentially a pair of line input 1081s with precisely stepped shared controls, also available as the 32087 new look model. And thus concludes our overview. Again, I don't claim to be an expert on this, and aside from the models that I have personal experience with, learned a lot in doing this research. I welcome any additional information or corrections, and will update the description as needed. Thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and mix the truth.